Good morning, everyone. This is Rachel with MediaBeacon. I am the customer experience analyst here, and some of you may have worked with me in a customer care capacity, but I believe that we are ready to begin today's webinar session on ACLs, which you are probably all familiar with. And I would also like to introduce you to today's presenter, Justin Williams, who most of you have probably also worked with in some kind of training capacity, whether that be a long time ago or recently. So as Justin previously stated, a recorded version of this webinar will be available, and questions will open around, I would say around 10:45 CST. We'll leave about the last 15 minutes for questions. We were thinking that if you could type your questions in the chat window, that might be better than everyone interjecting all at the same time. But if it's not too chaotic, we can open it up for actual discussion. So for those of you just joining us and everyone else, welcome to today's session, and let's begin.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I'd like to say thanks very much for everybody joining today, and we've got a bunch of things to cover, and we'll get through as many of these as possible. I'd like to show you some theory behind what we do at MediaBeacon, and I'd like to show you some actual examples of things that I have built in our system. I am running 2019.0 on my local machine. But let's take a look at our agenda before we begin. First 45 minutes or so, we'll be talking about things about the access control lists. Primarily, I think one of the things that we've been hearing is that it's really easy to end up with too many of them. And I want to talk about ways to prevent that. Sometimes it is warranted, and other times it's something to be avoided. So we'll talk about some of those, including the new content. It's not new, but our implementation of content pools in the 2018 and 2019 series, which you may not have actually seen before. And let me just add there we go. So now we have that a little bit larger. So let's just, I want to just quickly talk about what the relationship between groups and ACLs are. If you've taken any of my training courses, you've probably seen this image before, but it's worth talking about. Within MediaBeacon, there are different concepts. I like to call these system objects, and we have the idea of a user account, a group configuration. Inside that, there's an ACL configuration. Inside that that's where the workspaces live. They're subordinate to that, and then there's components on the workspaces. The thing about ACLs is that they're a MediaBeacon only phenomena. Groups in MediaBeacon are roughly analogous to the kind of groups that you would see in an IDP or an identity provider. That's going to be your SSO system, your LDAP system, your OpenAuth system, your Active Directory system, things like that. So the groups for MediaBeacon exist to kind of work with those systems. A group in an IDP is roughly analogous to a MediaBeacon group. An IDP cannot control everything a MediaBeacon group can do, and MediaBeacon can't really control what the groups do. Something important to remember is that there doesn't have to be an ACL within a group. If that's the case, a user can't use it. Something also worth mentioning that in 2018 and 2019, user accounts and groups are a little bit more bidirectional these days. And that means that I can add any number of groups to a user, and I can add any number of users to a group within the interface. And we'll see that a little bit later as we go on. So that's the basic structure and relationship of groups to ACLs. I wanted to talk a little bit about why we sometimes will end up with way too many ACLs. And in MediaBeacon, the way that most users experience this is if we have our ACL menu right here, and you might have a very long list of groups. Now, as a global administrator or somebody like that who is managing many different groups, that's not too big of a deal. But if you're a end user and you have 20 ACLs to choose from, that's maybe more than we need to expose any given any user to. So how do we prevent this, and how does it happen? So let's jump back here. If the user is part of too many groups, is really one of the primary issues, and this can be because there has not been a very efficient multi-role design put in place. Meaning that when you decide how many groups a user needs to be a part of to accomplish their work, you might have designed a whole number of groups that have very well-defined areas of capability, but the differences between them might not be very large, and may simply just be adding to extra ACLs, because what can sometimes happen is if you have fairly differentiated groups, you'll end up with way too many ACLs, because in order to have an active group, you have to have at least one ACL. So it's sometimes because you have just too complex of a group design. Sometimes that's due to an IDP defining the group membership in ways that really aren't relevant to MediaBeacon's usage. This is fortunately something that, as you can see at the bottom here, we're finding some ways to get around that. It used to be in the old days that MediaBeacon had to have the same groups, and the users that MediaBeacon authenticated against the IDP had to have the same groups as the IDP had. So that meant if you had tons and tons of different groups that users were a part of, they all got dropped into MediaBeacon, and you had to try to find a way to use what you had. So kind of back in the old days, we would get these really awful group names that weren't even at all relevant to what MediaBeacon was ending up using them for. Many systems these days can have the users groups defined independently of the IDP, but it depends on the system. So that's definitely something we're thinking about. The IDP systems are becoming more and more a way to authenticate, not necessarily a way to organize users. But some people are still in that boat. So it really depends on where you're at. Another time that ACLs proliferate is when there's too few groups. And this can also be an IDP locking you down to only having a very few number of groups, and then you have to add multiple ACLs within the same group. And my rule of thumb is usually it's best to have one group and one ACL sort of tied together and just have that. But sometimes we can't, we're stuck. And what we have to do is we have to end up having multiple ACLs in a given group. And I'll show you, just give you a quick look of kind of what that looks like. In MediaBeacon 2018 and 2019, groups and ACLs are substantially redesigned in terms of the interface, and we can have, as you can see, multiple ACLs within one specific group. And that might be because your users need to have sort of very separate roles with very separate different permissions, which we used to call them permissions. Now we refer to them as permission restrictions. And we'll talk a little bit about how those can end up differentiating ACLs when maybe they don't need to. So we'll jump back. And the last, one other thing I wanted to say is sometimes the reason we end up with too many ACLs is because we have too many different types of asset filtration. We want to have this group or this ACL only see certain assets, and have this group over here only see certain assets. And this can be overdone. And when you start having to add different ACLs because of this, it might be an indication that you're going too far and doing too much with this. The question, I think, overall is, what is the the need of having a really specific UI or UX, we could say, for the end user per task versus having just fewer overall UIs existing in the system. So that's a balance that I think needs to be thought out before groups and user capabilities need to be mapped out. My last case here is that there's just too many groups, and this is kind of an amalgamation of what I've talked about just recently. There's too many criteria and requirements, and they're too strict, and they generate unnecessary differentiation between user roles, and that's that UI UX thing I was talking about. So that's some of the overarching causes of proliferation that we might end up seeing. So obviously there are cases when you have to have more groups and sometimes more ACLs. And what are some a good rule of thumb for, like, when do we do this? Why should I create multiple groups? Why should I create multiple ACLs? And when should a user have multiple groups and ACLs as something they have access to? Obviously, as we'd said before, a really strong reason is the user has oversight responsibility for multiple user groups. That's like your art director or global administrator. They should have that, but that's, they're going to that's just kind of what their job is going to be. And another reason to create multiple ACLs is if a user has a small number of very different roles for very different sets of assets. And this is kind of where I see a lot of ACL overruns starting. A client might start to think about some cases where we have a photo retoucher that is only going to ever need to edit North American grocery store assets that have been approved by legal, and that's a very strict definition, for example, and it means there's going to have to be a whole lot of metadata to make that sorting possible. Or if they go too far, they're going to want to put things in different folders, and we'll talk about ways to avoid file system structure causing problems with this. So if you have something that's really complex like that, and then you start adding more business units or more slight variations to that, you end up with huge proliferation. My philosophy has always been it's better to sort than to sort a large number of assets using tools such as our search filter over here. What you'd want to do is you'd want to have very well-defined categorization. Not just simply keywords, but you can have, business unit, region, things like that. And we will talk a little bit about some of the things that I can use content pools to make sure that certain people don't see certain assets. And that's something that we can actually do on a user-by-user basis. So if we have this, I'll talk about a special secret assets model that we've got. Whenever you define your roles, be as broad as you can be to comply with your business rules. Sort of middle-of-the-road reasons. This happens a lot. Similar roles are given different metaforms. For example, I have a retouching group and a photo upload group. And when they upload assets, they just have a different form that they need to fill out. It's because of business rules or just how their given workflow operates. So sometimes a given group shouldn't see or shouldn't edit a particular piece of metadata, so we give them different metaforms. And that's I put it in middling reasons because you can go too far with it, as I said, but that's very typical. Legal or business rules sometimes demand very strict separation, and sometimes these business rules are not completely in touch with how a system like ours might operate. and we have to comply with what we have to comply with. But in and of itself, sometimes these don't make for a very good UI or a very good UX. The bad reasons, for example, and I've seen this, we want one role, as in the different capabilities the person has, want separate stores of assets, and they only want to see one set of assets in a specific interface. Clicking here, and we would get to a whole other set of assets. We can certainly do that, but it's probably easier to just filter for specific assets rather than to go to a whole other store of assets, which requires a whole other group and or a whole other ACL. And it can be quite a lot of overhead as you start expanding, and it starts to reduce your overall scalability of the system. Another thing is when we have customers who basically have a prior way that they operate, a prior SOP, and it was just assumed that a user should be in a bunch of roles called this. So they just take whatever the old system or the old, even if there wasn't a DAM in place, just assume that users have multiple roles, even though the situation has changed and the way that they people operate hasn't been updated. So change management not keeping up or with the system, allowing a new system like a new DAM to dictate an SOP or parts of it. So, and sometimes we have users who just want it to be like the previous system, and that's kind of like the prior one, but or the prior line there. So sometimes a little bit of change management, a little bit of saying, hey, it's going to be like this now, will make things overall more scalable for the system. When saying our users don't want to do something, you may want to think how that affects long-term growth or anything like that. All right, we're at about 10:23 here. So there's a couple really specific pieces of configuration that if you use too much, it will cause some stumbling blocks. So using the root path too much, and we'll get into a bit of that, define only the broadest asset categorization. And I'll get to exactly why that can be a problem in just a sec. The next thing here is I will often see people who are frustrated by not being able to find things, and I find out that they don't have very much metadata. And this is why they might wish to have assets pre-categorized into different ACLs or something like that. And if you don't have the metadata, then you're going to have to start using methods like putting things in folders and stuff like that, which isn't the most efficient. So not to belabor the point too much, but I look at metadata in two categories: descriptive or administrative. Descriptive is, just defines a character of the asset. Administrative is what metadata is used to sort, limit access, and other things like that. A piece of metadata can be used for both of them, but it's worth thinking about, is a piece of metadata going to be used administratively, or is it going to be used descriptively? So that is how you categorize your assets should really be with metadata. Sorry about that. And the last one, define your groups based on the combination of user needs. If there's two groups that are very similar except for just one thing, is it worth making two groups, or is it worth saying, hey, group A and group B, you're going to share a group, and there's one just really tiny difference between what both of you have. And if you do end up, this is something that has surprised me on a couple occasions. People who end up changing groups or ACL settings a lot. They're constantly redefining those things. And if that's the case, you might want to know why exactly you're doing that. Maybe there is a better way to configure these things for a broader group instead of doing things piecemeal. If you're changing group configuration every time you're doing a new promo, that's probably going to be something that's going to really slow you down and prevent your scalability and maybe make a whole bunch of ACLs. So I think that I'm not going to really pound on this this particular point too heavily, but one thing I want to talk about is the concept of a set of assets. And a set of assets, in MediaBeacon we might call it a selection, but that sort of implies a selected state. I'm just talking about any assets that share certain characteristics. Usually it's metadata. Sometimes it's because they're in the same folder. And if you don't have these categories in metadata and you have them instead of in things like file names, it might make things really, really hard to find. If I'm just looking for a blank file name, it doesn't tell me the overlap. As I don't perhaps know that file 030 is just by the file name. I don't know that it's a promo for holiday and it's cats. But if I have metadata in there, I can very easily find all this stuff out through sort of a Venn diagram of searches. But you can get out of control with this. I've seen people who want to have sets that are defined by really complex conjunctions of metadata, many ands and ors and nots, all in the same search to define a particular set of assets. It's usually best, if possible, to have metadata populating the system to define things like visibility and downloadability as single values in a specific field. That's usually the best way to do it if it's possible. And it just really depends on how your metadata structure is, but thinking about how you structure that metadata and there's absolutely no problem or reason not to create fields just for that filtering. So, and then the question is, how do you administrate that? So, let's take a look at a really specific set of examples here for things that I have ended up seeing in the past. This is just sort of a very basic example set of requirements we might have for a setup. A company has 3 business groups, and they don't have to be separate businesses. Sometimes they're just divisions of the same organization. I usually call them business groups, though. And so a company has 3 business groups. Each business group has a separate set of assets, and that's usually something I see a lot. Every business group or division will be said to own a certain set of assets. And then assets are further subdivided by work in progress, a library, a repository for reusable assets, an archive, not general. Most people can't see them. You'd have 2 roles in the system, general users and managers. And some general users have access to multiple business units. All managers have access to all business groups. And corporate rules state that assets generated by each business unit must stay in a unique directory. So that's very similar to number 2. So how do I end up setting something like this up? And there's a number of ways that we can end up doing that. And I'll make this a little bit larger so we can all see it. There are some bad ways and some good ways to do this. Kind of the worst way to do it is to separate by asset status. So works in progress, a library folder, and an archive folder, and have redundancy on each of those levels. In this case, to do what those requirements want, we have to have 3 to 9 groups with 1 ACL each, and the manager has 9 ACLs. Oops, that's meant to actually say groups. Sorry about that. But we'd basically have 9 ACLs that the managers would have. And because we're filing things in these folders, it doesn't really encourage rich metadata. And here's the biggest problem. It requires, any sharing requires copying assets, which is really something that should be avoided. File duplication is almost never what we want to do inside of a DAM. A little bit better than that is when we break our structure a little bit and we add something like a content folder, and then we would go ahead and have a group A, group B, and group C. And that's perfectly fine, but if we want to have a folder structure then dictate your work in progress library and archive folder, that can be a problem too, because it would mean that I have to have a separate ACL to look at archive things. So that ends up being a problem as well. Even better than this one is we're going to pull out those subdivisions, and we're going to say that things like archive and library are just going to be metadata, and we'll use our ACL search filters to define those things so they can be easily found. One other thing that that's still the case, though, is I still can't share very easily, and that's because of how we have our root paths. So the root paths are in bold here, so each group still has their ACL root path as a separate folder. The model that I usually go with is something like this. I'll have the assets in 3 different folders, and all of them will actually have the content folder, the higher level one, as their root folder. This means that their ACLs do not restrict them from sharing assets at all. What we do is we need to have 2 separate pieces of metadata. One is going to be ownership, and one is going to be sharing. And I have a live example of that I'll show you. But just by adding metadata, I can share this with, share an asset with another group, but it still lives inside of my folder, and but another group just gets access to it. So that's kind of the way that I would suggest doing it is this best model right here. So let's, I'm going to jump over into the interface here, and I'm going to log in with a incognito session. And let's log in as user A. Okay. So in this particular group that I've got here, I just have just one ACL, so you don't see the ACL menu. I have a directory browser. I wouldn't necessarily give this to a user, but I just wanted to show this. I can see that there are certain things inside of Group A, and there's certain things inside of Group B. But honestly, I don't really need to give these users a directory browser, because I can allow them to filter using the search filter, and I can have them see these are the things that are Group A, and those are always going to be those. But I can also see which are owned by Group B, and I can also see those things which are shared specifically with Group A. So by just using a couple different metadata fields and the names of the business units or divisions, you don't have to, you can actually eliminate the directory browser completely. And all I have to do in order to share one of these things is to change its metadata. Now, usually you don't want to allow users to do this by themselves. It's more of an administrative capacity. So in this case, business unit and the group sharing are not editable. Only an administrator would be able to change those, so I could then change which groups they're shared with. So that's another thing that I would do is these are freely visible, but you can't, you'd lock them off so that can't be seen or changed, I should say. And I also have Group B, of course, and there are some things from Group A shared with them. So by doing that kind of setup, as you can see here in the Group A and B setup, I've got their root path set to webinar and then content. And all the folders differentiating Group A and Group B are below that. But I can always see anything that's tagged with Group A, and I can always see something that's tagged with Group B in the shared with. And that is all coming from this group, our search filter here. And let me show you what that looks like so you have an idea of what, how the metadata and the search converge to actually accomplish that task. So we'll just jump over to our advanced search area. We'll take a look at the admin searches, and I'll just load up that search. So all I need to do is I've got our business unit. This search is going to return any asset that the business unit is Group A or the group sharing contains Group A. So I can share with multiple groups, and I can see it if it has Group A in either of those two things. And they're on two different fields because I don't want to change the ownership of something by sharing with something else. And business unit is a single value field and group sharing is a multi-value field. So that's how I have those particular fields set up. I also have them connected to a dictionary, which is very helpful. You could get it quite a bit more complex and have a dictionary per group for this, but it's always handy to make sure you've got everything spelled canonically in a dictionary. Otherwise, you might a mistype, as I want to do, can make a search not work properly. But that's very helpful. All right. So something that I see a lot is the desire to make sure that every group has, or every ACL has really specific interface requirements. And we talked about this a little bit before. And one where I tend to see this happening is with the search filter. People who are designing the system want to make sure that everybody only has those fields that are relevant strictly to them, and they never, ever, ever see anything else. Now, this can be a requirement, depending on your business rules, or this can just be for the ease of the end user. And one thing that I've kind of encountered is having two almost identical even groups, but we end up having to differentiate them, having to add a whole other group because there is a desire to have just a really a different search filter. Say, having even something as trivial as having keywords in a different place means that I would have to have two different search filters and then two different workspaces and then two different ACLs and probably two different groups. As an alternative to that overhead, something you can fairly easily do as an admin is instead of having two separate workspaces, you could just add a separate search filter that's that is configured slightly differently. So we'll add another search filter, and one nice thing that you can do is you can turn on the toggleable. All right, say that. So if I want to have these two slightly different components here, I can have that save a whole lot of space in the interface by turning on the toggleable components, meaning that only one can be opened at any given time. So it doesn't constantly have one of these open for both users, so it can save space. So you can have Group A and Group B both using the same workspace, and then they can look at just what they need to look at, rather than having to have a commingled set of those things altogether. It's a bit of a compromise, but it will save overhead if you're planning on doing things like onboarding lots of groups. And it does come down to change management and seeing what the users will tolerate. But rather than making a whole other ACL or something like that, maybe just sharing a little bit of screen space is more preferable. So that's something I will often advocate for. All right, we are at we've got just a few more minutes left here. And I want to talk about content pools real quick. This is a concept that we used to have in older MediaBeacon, and it was revamped considerably in the 20T.1 and further. And what this does is it uses search substitutions. Some of you may have seen that we can add these strings that have a $ in front of them. And what they do is they pull data from the user's account profile. So if I have the word example in a field, and I type in as my search criteria on that particular field, user LDAP first, right here, oops, what it's going to do is it's going to look in that field not for the this string, it's going to look for the word example. And that's something that we've been using more and more as time goes on, but we also just determined that we can use the content pools concept in a very similar fashion. In 2018.1 and forward, we have a section in the a section in each user account called content pools, and you can add multiples of these content pools, and each has a name and a value. So in order, basically what it's doing is it's adding kind of another one of these user account fields, but it's specific to a user. So I basically have a field called secret pool, and its value is movie promo, and it's just for that user. So if we go and take a look at, let's just log out here. There we go. I'm going to jump over to webinar admin here. And I've got a bunch of assets that have some special access. Whoops. There we go. So some of these assets are tagged with a non-disclosure agreement, and some are tagged as movie promo. And you may have noticed, or maybe not, that I didn't see a picture of a Ferrari. Basically what we can do with these is we can tag a specific asset, and in so doing, it will hide it from everybody who doesn't have NDA General as a content pool in their user account. So the way that that's accomplished is that I'm going to be using two different search filters. Certainly I'm filtering for everything that's Group A or is shared with Group A, but I'm also further filtering using our search filtering options, and I have the admin secret pool search. And to show you what that one is set up like, this allows anything in this particular view component to be seen if its special access is null, or if the special access field contains whatever the user has in their secret pool value. So if this user has movie promo, they can see assets that are tagged with movie promo, and nobody else can. So this is another way to prevent having way too many ACLs. You can have secret groups, and you can have many different secret groups just based on a single piece of metadata in an asset. So really, really powerful way to make some of that stuff work. And let's see, we're at about 10:46. I'm going to show you one last thing and then we'll open it up for questions. There was something that I wanted to show everybody, which was a way of using upload capability to automatically sort things and use it with our multi-group setup here. So I'm going to set so this side is going to be our admin so they can see everything that's going on. And I'm going to log in as user of Group A here. And this user wants to upload something. Now, something that's new in 2018 and 19 is we finally got straightened around a way of assigning a metaform for an entire ACL. So I don't have to configure it in the on the components. I don't have to configure it on the workspace at all. So sometimes people want to have a separate workspace for upload. I implemented that because sometimes people really like that. So let's upload either a squirrel or the world's most smug armadillo. I'm going to go with the armadillo myself. So we'll go ahead and we're going to upload. And so that's a smug armadillo. And one thing I've done here is I've given myself the ability to upload and define the sharing all at once. So I want to say, okay, Group A, Group B, and Group C. So I'll go ahead and submit that. And it's going to happen so fast you won't even see it. But what I'm doing is I'm making sure that all uploads always go to the upload folder because both Group A and B have their root folders set as content. So they share an upload folder. But as you can see here, nothing is inside the upload folder. And when we take a look here, we can see very easily that we've got our armadillo, and we can see that it is inside Group A. So what happened was I used a visual workflow to take a look at the metadata and to automatically move it to a folder called Group A. And you'll also see that I have culled the value Group A out of group sharing because it was unnecessary. And this is extremely easy to set up, and I'll show you just a quick overview of what that looks like. So we've got, in our admin view here, we've got an auto sort visual workflow script. And it's really pretty simple. I'm just looking inside the upload folder, and I'm making sure that the business unit field is not null. And if it's not, anytime an asset is added to the upload folder, it's going to first take a look and say, does it contain Group A? If it does, go to the Group A output, et cetera, and then what this will do is it will just remove, if it happens to be there, Group A from the shared groups because it's redundant. And then I'm going to move that to a specific folder, and I'm going to use the value of what's inside the business unit. So the value of the group name in the field becomes a folder that is the target of this to be moved. So it's just completely automatic, and we don't have to have users moving things into folders. We can completely get rid of their of that directory browser in that case. Should there be an error, there's an error folder, but that's just for safety's sake. and I also have another workflow that does just the removal of extra share groups should someone change those in future. So really simple things to set up, and that's how I can use a much more efficient set of groups and to automatically route things where they need to go, and we don't have to have a lot of different ACLs to do that. So, all right, it's about 10:51 here, so I would like to know if anybody has any questions about the things that we've learned here today, and not just this, but as we would like to have these webinars be a regular occurrence. If you have any questions or comments on things that you'd like to see in future, I'd definitely like to hear those either now or offline, either way. So, Rachel, do we have any questions that we've got so far?
No, no one has asked any questions in chat, but we can certainly open it up for discussion
Sure,
now.
absolutely. Oh, yes. We have a question. Do you have any documentation on content pools? And the answer is yes, we absolutely do. If you go to university.mediabeacon.com or mediabeaconuniversity.com, and I don't know why I'm typing in caps here, but so we have an article here, Content Pools in 2018.1, and we have a whole article on how to use that and some really interesting information on how we can have one user be part of multiple content pools using this construction. So you'll learn quite a bit of information at MediaBeacon University. So that's something hopefully will be very, very useful. Any other questions from our audience today?
We have no questions. Does
Hey,
anyone
Justin.
have?
Oh, sure.
Go ahead.
Hi, this is John.
Yes.
I have a question regarding ACLs, because, a lot of what you showed, about having multiple ACLs and directed at specific users, how do we get around the workflows with that? Because, we have users that use content in different ways, and one of the things you mentioned that was kind of alarming to us is a lot of the content we use is shared, but it's also, for example, if we take an image and we put it in one InDesign document, it may be used differently in another InDesign document.
Mm-hmm.
How do we get around the versioning it without copying that to make sure that the right version was used in that InDesign document when we go back to grab it and reprint it?
Mm-hmm.
Can we change the color of a background in an image?
Sure. And the question is, I think it has a lot to do with your strategy of, and this is shifting gears a little bit. It has to do with your strategy of what you want to have as canonical assets inside of your DAM. So if you've got a logo, for example, and in one instance the background is green, in one instance the background is purple or something like that, the question is, what's the canonical version of that asset? Do you make a new version every time you place something, or do you actually make a new asset? And that comes down to kind of your individual choice. One thing that you can do to use versions.
The reason I ask this is because a lot of the don'ts that you put up there are a lot of things that we're doing based on our workflows and based on our user experiences and their needs. And my concern is, we have many instances where files need to be copied because they're concerned that something small is being changed in an image, and they don't want to put, let's say, on a version one market versus another market.
Sure. Oh, there we go. So I didn't have something that was a managed version. Now, one thing about the managed versions is that I've got different versions here, and you always have the top asset, which is the most recent version made. And the way that might typically be used is if you want to have, I'm going to change this logo slightly, and this is now the new version. Instead of making a new asset, I have the canonical asset, and this is at the top of what we kind of call the asset stack, and that's what everyone should use going forward. But if you click on Show in view component here on the other older assets, those are still assets in the system. They're normally hidden. So you can use these. And the res isn't very good, but these still exist in the system. They're not gone. So you can go back and use these individual assets if you want to.
So let me ask you this. If I have an InDesign document, let's say I have version A, B, and C, and one document was created with version A, and I created another document with version B of an image, when I go back to reprint version A, will it pull up version B of that placed image, or will it pull up version A?
It depends on how you have it. It depends on. Yeah, it depends on how you have it linked. But if you're looking for things by the record ID, those are generally pretty stable. So I'd want to take a look at exactly what your use case is a little bit more. But that is something that you can take a look at doing, because the file path to versions is actually very different than the top of the stack. They live inside of something called rendition, so they are in a distinctly different directory inside of MediaBeacon. So that's fairly easy to differentiate between those two assets, either by the record ID or by its file path. So, very good question.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I need to figure that out a little bit more, but I will on my own time and not everyone else's. Thanks.
Well, that's what I would absolutely love to do more with these webinars, is have it doesn't have to be about the topic, but it can be about just any general MediaBeacon question, because the more information we can all share, the better. So, do we have any other questions from the audience today? We have a couple more minutes left. I think I can probably field a question or two.
If no other questions, does anyone have any ACL tips and tricks that they would like to share with the broader group?
All right. Well, I won't call on anybody to give us their individual tips and tricks. But we do want to remain engaged with our users, and if you have any questions you'd like to have addressed, topics for webinars you'd like to see, we'd like to make this a monthly event. So any more information that we can show, any comments, likes, dislikes, we're open to all of those. So please let us know, and we'll be joining you next month with another topic. And we, of course, look forward to talking to everybody at that time. Did you have anything else, Rachel?
I do not. I just want to thank everyone for joining us today, and look out for the next webinar.
Well, thank you very much, guys.
Thanks very much, everybody. Have a beautiful day.
Have a great day, everyone.